I've been doing this for over 40 years and playing abroad a lot. I can say very simply that when you play a concert and you see the expression on people's faces in the audience and you meet with audience members who are deeply moved, it sort of is a constant reminder, hey, I'm doing something that is very special. I shouldn't ever take for granted or take too lightly that being a performer on stage has a deep impact on a lot of people in the audience. They wouldn't pay the prices. They wouldn't sit through a 2.5 hour concert if there wasn't something incredibly gratifying that they were getting from that music. So when you're a professional musician, I think it's really good to remind yourself that you're actually doing something that can change people's lives.
Yes, that's Jeff Lang, Associate Principal Horn in Philadelphia Orchestra, horn faculty at Curtis Institute, Temple University, and Bard College. His very special solo album called One World Horn features unaccompanied horn music from around the globe to promote world peace. In this episode, we talk about everything from the commonalities between his most successful students to the fundamentals and paradoxes of accuracy on the horn, chop recovery strategies, the pandemic, and what Jeff would love to see evolve in the horn world as a whole. Listen closely, and you may become a more virtuosic player and sonic genius as a result of these insights. Stay hydrated and enjoy the episode. All right. Well,
Sure.
welcome aboard, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
As we were getting started, you were just talking about learnings from the pandemic, and that sparked a real curiosity for me. This was a totally transformational and new time for musicians in the music industry. From your vantage point, what were some of those big learnings from the pandemic period?
So when we started, if I go back in the history of the orchestra, the first night that sort of everything shut down almost nationwide, almost to date, very odd. If we go back and think about it, was March 13th. And around that time, I think on March 13th, we had planned to do a concert of two Beethoven symphonies. As it turned out, we did do a concert of two Beethoven symphonies, but the audience was not invited. But we had video cameras. We had a very scaled down. We had good audio, of course, always good audio in the orchestra. We had a few video cameras set up to capture that concert, and we went on very early on, the first actually, on a live stream concert with no audience, full on concert, very odd experience because we thought we were going into this sort of new territory that everyone knew that it was something very serious going on. And so we played to this empty hall, and it was a fantastic concert, and it got a lot of worldwide views, a lot of interest very early on. I'm not saying that we were the best at this or the earliest at this, but the Philadelphia Orchestra, for a lot of different reasons, had a very early footprint on the virtual, so to speak, virtual orchestra experience. So then, soon after, days after, we sort of mobilized, and I was on the artistic committee at that time, and we sort of mobilized and figured out this might be a long time. This might go on for a while. So we sort of mobilized, and we started brainstorming immediately, literally the next day, of what to do. And the obvious answer to that was, musicians performing somehow from their homes. And we started producing, and my son himself put together about 30 videos for the orchestra during this time in the very early days of chamber music, and people sending in their parts on iPhones, and very low tech, but somehow we gradually upped the game as we all learned, become more savvy with doing things, recording things virtually, pasting things together, making chamber music, making these pieces seem real. And it was a learning process that we were sort of all going through with a common goal of just two things, actually: staying connected with the audience, who is clearly in great need, very hungry for content, because their concerts, their whole existence around the arts and the musical experience was just completely shut down and stripped from them. And the musicians ourselves having no outlet to perform. So we were sort of very early on pasting together chamber music, solo performances, trying to stay every way connected with the audience. And we were very successful in that. And as I said, we learned a lot along the way. And we went from getting, 100 views to 1,000 views, and suddenly millions of views. And the virtual Philadelphia Orchestra was formed. And then the next stage of that was the digital stage, which went into full production when we did get back into Verizon Hall, when we were performing, complete pieces and works with very, elaborate recording and video techniques. And so it was a slow progression, but we were very early on doing this. It was artistically challenging. It was artistically rewarding. And the learning process, the learning curve was very fast. The members individually started upping their game with their home studios, from just recording something from an iPhone to actually setting up a little home studio with good quality gear.
What kind of gear did you pick up?
Well, I was fortunate because my son is an audio engineer and he was sort of ahead of the curve on that. So I already had pretty good gear here. And we had good mics, we had good audio, we had everything set up. But I did help in big part of what I was doing at the time was sort of advising people in the orchestra to what affordable gear they could get, camera and affordable mics and all that sort of thing, how to set up, how to use Zoom, all these sort of things. We were very active. At one point, we created this whole tutorial for the orchestra members, how to do it, how to get gear, how to up your game. And it was sort of a unique time, but everything ramped up to some, I look back on some of these performances as some very complicated chamber music that we did. And some of it's pretty darn good.
I have a bubbling, just burning curiosity, both for the audience and for my sake. You said you have some very good gear at home, and then that you had some recommendations for other folks in the orchestra that didn't already have gear. Specifically, what kind of mics are you using that you really like? What kind of gear did folks end up using as far as make and model?
Sure. Folks ended up using, there was, Zoom microphones are very good. Some of the Zoom video stuff is very good. Blue Yeti was very popular, affordable, and actually very good. I know that at one time Sweetwater was out of the Blue Yeti mics.
Oh, wow.
But they were pretty good. Some of the Sennheiser stuff was very, very good.
And what do you use?
Oh my gosh, we have so many high quality. We have some Sheps here, and we have some very high quality stuff. But I believe that I ended up, for my daily sort of recording and practicing, I did use some Zoom things. Some of the early on things were recorded on Zoom. I do have a nice Audio Technica mic, which I do have maybe right behind me, which is this one right
let's see it
here. Let me get that in front. This is very affordable, very good. Audio Technica, let's see what it is specifically. AT2020 USB mic, excellent sound, excellent for everything.
Nice.
So this is pretty good.
When you're miking yourself on the horn, couple questions. You normally do a stereo signal or mono signal, and then where do you place the mic relative to your horn?
Usually stereo signal, and usually in the front, because in the teaching and in the it depends. If I'm teaching, it's in the front because I'm speaking, and if I'm demonstrating, in the front is fine. If I am recording something, when we recorded things here, we recorded front and back. I was able to mix in because my son Johannes was.
And what's the ratio or so front to back? Would you say it's like 60-40?
The back is less. The back is for a little bit of presence, a little bit of front of the note, a little bit of presence. The front is more for the realistic horn sound. But that's very common. That's very common in recording studios too.
Did you come up with any sort of, like, I use Ableton a lot. I've been doing this whole live looping almost every day for 30 days. I performed a live looper set.
Oh, cool.
And I started to come up with channel presets that, okay,
Mm-hmm.
this is my French horn preset,
Yeah, yeah,
it's got an SSLG, mono
yeah,
strip plugin, blah, 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 with this
yeah, yeah, yeah.
compression, this EQ,
Right, right, right,
and a
right,
little
right.
bit of reverb. And for
Sure.
me, a little bit of auto tune when I'm doing looping.
Oh, yeah,
I don't have to
yeah,
worry about playing everything in tune. It just,
yeah, 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 yeah,
it's
yeah.
really nice.
No, that's very nice. I mean, we did actually have to tune some things because we were getting parts in. We were doing string quartets and all sorts of things. We were getting things in. So some of it is is little editing magic, and not too much because if you perfectly tune everything, then it starts to sound a little antiseptic. And
That's one of the hardest things about the remote collaboration is that there's something that happens in ensemble playing where everyone's listening and adjusting at the same time. And you just don't get that in the digital collab realm. And it's really hard to adjust to that.
it's really hard, but the good engineers, the good editors can adjust what is egregious and leave a natural element to it that it sounds real. I mean, a lot of pop music you hear nowadays is just tuned so perfectly that it sounds it sounds a little bit strange to our ears. But so there's some things that are better off not corrected, you know.
And I imagine that you and the orchestra ran, it sounds like a ton of experiments.
Yeah.
You got together, you said the day after, and probably I imagine you're thinking, how do we keep making money?
Oh yeah.
How do we reach the audiences?
Correct.
How do we use our musicians
Right.
to their fullest potential during this time?
Correct.
And maybe even potentially, how do we make a difference in this shifting landscape of the world that was totally unexpected to create more harmony and togetherness?
Oh, absolutely.
How did those considerations come together? What kind of experiments really worked? And did you have any experiments that were a flop in terms of digital collaboration?
Incrementally, the whole experience started growing and then started multiplying and multiplying and multiplying, and our audience base became a worldwide audience base, even to the point we had a live concert with a team of scientists in Antarctica. We're watching the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was really, really quite amazing. So it was a very incremental thing. It was sort of it was an experiment, but it wasn't an experiment. It was real time. It was not intended, and it showed just how important, it showed how important the arts are. It showed really how important and how hungry people all over the world. I mean, we had listeners from well, we had all the continents. I can't say we had all the countries, but we were keeping track of continents, and Antarctica was a big deal. So it was a very sort of natural process, but it was interesting to see how the whole thing spread, and it was very, very sort of reassuring to know that the arts are alive and well, and that so many people are hungry for this. And you have to remember also, it was a very nice, what's the word, balm or something. It was a very nice alternative to people who were home and very stressed about COVID. So it was an alternative. It was something that we had many, many comments to say, oh my gosh, you provided us such relief, such a peaceful place, such an oasis, a place we could go to listen to beautiful music in our own homes when we're kind of, undergoing the stress and uncertainty of COVID. And so that was something that we realized we were providing something much more than just music for people to really to calm. It was calming,
Yeah, and that kind of gets into the real function or possibilities for the function of music in the world. You've had a long life with music and probably every twist of the human experience, the highs, the lows. In
Mm.
your journey with music, how do you understand what music is capable of doing for folks?
Well, I can only understand from my own personal experiences, and when if we talk about horn related matters, or we talk about horn technique or teaching things or anything to do with the music business, I can share only my personal experiences. And I can say that traveling around the world, I've been doing this for over 40 years and playing abroad a lot. I lived in a foreign country for 7 years. I can say very simply that when you play a concert and you see the expression on people's faces in the audience, and you meet with audience members after the concert who are deeply moved, sometimes much more deeply moved than you are by the concert, is sort of a constant reminder of, hey, I'm doing something that is very special. And some people really, really take this in internally. And I shouldn't ever take for granted or take too lightly that being a performer on stage has a deep impact on a lot of people in the audience. A lot of the reason why people come to concerts, it's not to be seen. It's not for social things. It's not just, I mean, yes, there is that factor. Obviously, the in thing to do or to hang out with my friends or whatnot. Most of our audience comes to have a deeper experience. They wouldn't pay the prices. They wouldn't sit through a 2.5 hour concert if there wasn't something incredibly gratifying that they were getting from that music. So when you're a professional musician, I think it's really good to remind yourself that you're sort of you're providing a service. Yes, you're a professional musician, it's your job, but you're actually doing something that can change people's lives. Many people will come up to me and say, I heard the Philadelphia Orchestra 10 years ago in Japan, or I heard the Philadelphia Orchestra, blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And they'll have this very specific, or I was in that concert. I was in, when you played in the Musikverein in Vienna in 2005, I was in that concert. And when you're a professional musician playing in an orchestra like the Philadelphia Orchestra, these conversations, these experiences are not unique. They happen very often. So it kind of is a reminder, hey, what I'm doing is impactful. It's really impactful.
Yeah, that's beautiful because I think a lot of musicians struggle with getting jaded about their impact. Or I remember, and also struggling with imposter syndrome. There was a line that I learned that sometimes I need to use inside myself. Someone will come up to me and say, "Oh, you're so talented. That was such a good show." And maybe I thought, "Oh man, I missed 20 notes," And the line that I learned from this cellist is, "Oh, fooled him again."
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know
yeah, yeah,
but that's
yeah.
kind of at the jaded and cynical level.
Correct.
And what I want for myself and for musicians is to really deepen and open their heart to that kind of acknowledgement. Yeah, this
Yeah.
actually did touch somebody. This is a service.
Right, right. I would recommend to any musicians that listen to this, I would recommend anyone to surround yourself with like-thinking people, like-thinking musicians who understand that. I mean, there's an old saying, there's a friend, when I was playing on Broadway, they used to say, well, if you want to hear a musician complain, just give him a job. And that is, there's a certain truth to that, but I play with a handful of, not a handful, more than a handful of musicians in the orchestra, and in my whole career, that is not just a job. Yes, there are some. They are fooled them one more time. There are those, but my advice is to surround yourself with like-minded people who are in it for the right reasons, and really are in it for the right reasons.
Yeah. Yep. Preach.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
makes me think of, I wanted to ask you about markers of success in students. And
Hmm.
there are these sayings like you're the average of the 5 people that you spend your
Yeah.
time around. Definitely surrounding yourself with like-minded, devoted, passionate, and
Hmm.
value-driven people is
Hmm.
a important strategy for succeeding. What commonalities do you see in players, students of yours that have had big successes versus
Hmm.
those that weren't really able to make a career happen in music or reach their
Yeah.
goals?
That's a great question. And over my years, that's a really great question. Over my years of teaching, the students that I see that have succeeded come into their lessons. And I know this is going to sound very simple, but then again, it goes back to my point of I can just relate my own experiences over, having teaching several, well, my tens and tens and tens of students. The ones that seem to be successful come into their lesson very serious. They come into the lesson very focused. And when they play, they're not just phoning it in, they're playing with an intensity, whether it's good playing or not. That's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone that would come into a lesson and playing with an intensity and a focus and a seriousness of what they're doing every minute. And that's not always easy to do. But over the years, I've realized that the students that come in that play with this sort of red hot curiosity is a big thing. I mean, people say, oh, follow your passion, follow what you're passionate about in life, follow what you're passionate about in life. I'd rather say, follow what you're most curious about.
Hmm.
And so the people that come into lessons are the most curious and sort of most on fire seem to have the most success, not relevant always to just natural ability, natural talent. So it's more of the desire, the fire, the focus that then you have something to work with. Then you have something that you can really shape and polish and get a player to be successful. And if I think back, Curtis, for example, of the recent 6 or 7 players who have gotten really high quality jobs, I was thinking it is sort of exactly to your question a few days ago. What's the common thread? And the common thread is the seriousness and the sort of like white hot focus when you come in. If you have an hour lesson and it may be in the morning and you've had a lot to do and you're hungry and you just broke up with your girlfriend and you have all this, all these life things that happen to a professional musician. But in the short time, if you can put that aside, and when you pick up the horn, sound like you're serious about what you're doing, those are the people that seem to succeed.
And how would you describe the other side of the spectrum, the ones that aren't red hot or aren't
Hmm.
curious? What are you seeing there? How do you know when you have a student that's not
Hmm.
exactly exhibiting that?
Well, you can see you have to encourage them. If it takes if it takes me several times to get something out of a player and finally get something that sounds really great and has their stamp on it, their personal voice, their personal stamp, and sounds terrific, but then comes back the next week and it reverts back to the original. And then I have to go through the whole cheerleader thing again to get them up to level. And then, okay, now that's terrific, that's fantastic, that's where you need to be. And the next week coming back, we take another step back. So that's something that you can see as a teacher, that if you keep endlessly trying to draw out good playing out of a player and you get it, but then it sort of slips back, then we're missing, then we're not self-aware. And one thing I want to say in general about brass playing, I find that brass players are not often enough self-aware of what is actually coming out the bell of the horn.
Yeah, what do you
um,
think they're paying attention to instead?
I think they're paying attention to a lot of other things that just don't matter.
For
That
example.
getting notes, playing loud, not missing notes, just getting through repertoire, playing through audition lists. I'm going to such and such audition. I'm going to this audition. I'm going to this. I'm preparing this. Oh, I have a recital. I'm going through the recital repertoire, doing a lot of things except for listening to themselves.
Really listening to what's coming out of the bell, perceiving, not judging.
Yes, and being very self-aware and being critical in a positive way. It's never good to be down on your playing. It's never good to be critical in a unproductive way, but it is at certain point, if you want to reach a high level of musicianship and a high level of artistry, you do have to be sort of incredibly honest with yourself.
Yeah.
You have to be very honest in a positive way and very self-aware of what's happening. So the students that are also the most self-aware of how they sound seem to be the ones that also succeed.
Yeah,
And
interesting.
that's not, and I say this to be self-aware like it's an easy thing. It's actually not that easy sometimes, you know.
Remind me, I believe you're a practitioner of meditation, is that right?
No, my wife is. I
Your
don't.
wife is.
I don't really meditate. Yeah. That's something. I mean, I think meditation is great. My wife meditates, and I have many students, many teachers. A lot of people are very into it. I actually don't,
Mhm.
but maybe I do other things the closest thing I can come to meditation is sort of interesting when I have a long drive. I have a long commute to Philly. I probably drive the furthest of anyone in the orchestra. And just the other night, after a meeting, one of my friends in the committee said, "What do you do in your long drive? You listen to music. What do you do?" And I say, "You know what? I love the silence. I very rarely put music or the radio on. And I get in my car after a concert or going to a concert. And most of the time, you ask my kids, my wife, and my friends, I just love that absolute silent time. So I was thinking that may be some form of meditation because I really love it.
Yeah, a teacher of mine broke meditation into a few different subcategories. One was mindfulness, which is the practice of watching, right? Being aware of what is in the present moment. And then
Mm-hmm.
meditation was defined as a quiet stillness or being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there was manifestation, which is when you cultivate a quality such as peace or compassion or visualize yourself playing in the Philadelphia Orchestra
Yeah. Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
putting energy towards an outcome. There's kind
Yeah.
of three different kinds and
Right.
certainly others as well. It does sound very meditative. You're driving. For me,
Yeah.
that's been the way that I've built self-awareness is through meditation, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to focus, the ability to inquire within.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
something you said
Yeah.
really sparked a memory of this book, Choke, that talks about why athletes and musicians screw up in
Mm-hmm.
performance.
Yeah.
And the whole point of the book was that if you have an internal focus, so for example, the golfer who's thinking, okay, I'm going to twist my back or I'm going to hold the club this
Mm-hmm.
way, or the horn player who thinks, I'm going to arch my tongue and use my
Yeah.
breath, X, Y,
Right.
Z, that's an internal focus of control. The
Mm-hmm.
external focus of control would be, I want it to sound this way. I want the
Yeah.
ball to go over there.
Mm-hmm.
You're far more likely to choke in performance when you're focusing on internal processes.
Absolutely.
There's
Yeah.
a time and a place to cultivate and think, what are my chops doing right here? But performance is not the time for it. And
Yeah.
we could be spending a lot of our time listening to what's coming out of the bell, the external
Mm-hmm.
focus.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is just some
And
data that corroborates what you're saying.
well, there's an interesting thing too. You bring up an interesting point because I think about my own self after a concert. Being a horn player, of course, none of us horn players like to miss notes. And sometimes what I have realized over the many, many years of doing this is sometimes if I miss a note, it really bothers me. And sometimes as I miss notes, it doesn't bother me. Okay, what's the difference? And the difference is very clear. If I'm playing well, and I'm playing the music and I happen to miss a few notes and I'm having a good night and I miss a few notes, I never feel bad about the performance. But if I'm trying to play clean and if I'm trying to just play to not screw up and I miss a few notes, then I go back to the parking garage and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was just, you know,
Yeah.
so it's
It's the
so
ultimate
the act,
insult to
yeah,
be
it's the ultimate
out of alignment
insult.
with your values and to
Yeah.
miss notes.
And then there's notes. And then here's the secret. here's the dirty little secret that we all should know as horn players. Then we get archival recordings of each performance. So very often, and our engineers usually throw them into Dropbox right away. So I can literally, by the time I get home, I can listen to that performance. And again, my own experience after many years of doing this. But most times, 95% of the times, if I've made maybe some mistakes in the orchestra that I was annoyed about, when I listen back, I can't even hear them.
Same.
And I can't even, and this is not, this is no tricks. I'm not just saying. Sometimes it's just not sometimes it's absolutely not audible. And horn players have to realize that that is most of the times we're in the texture, most of the times that even if you're playing a solo passage, if you're playing a Brahms solo in a Brahms symphony, you happen to chip a note. Well, I've got news for you. Lots of times you can't hear that. So the things that we concern ourselves are, sometimes we really get ourselves all tied up in things that actually are not a big deal. And sometimes if I feel like I've played really great and I go home, listen to the recording, and maybe it's not so great. And sometimes I've just felt, oh, that wasn't my best concert. And I go back and listen to it. I thought, well, that was actually pretty good. There's a certain amount of reality to performing as the performer versus the listener, that there's a very big disconnect, you know. And it's one of the things that can sort of lift the weight for horn players, because I think horn players particularly sometimes can forgive themselves a little more.
Certainly getting out from under the pressure of missed notes is almost a guaranteed recipe to be more accurate.
Yeah.
But for for players that are struggling with accuracy and genuinely are still having a hard time playing accurately most of the time, what kind of tricks or practices have you seen that help people to be more accurate, cultivate that?
Yeah, there's a couple things that help. There's some nuts and bolts things that do help. Playing in tune is a very big point. And this goes to the point of being self-aware too. Playing in tune, a missed note is just usually a very out of tune note. So that's really what happens. So that's an oversimplification, but that's actually true. So one thing is to work on your intonation impeccably, work with drones. I really play a lot of scales and arpeggios. I really work a lot with drones. I'm not such a fan of looking at the tune or looking at the dial going, but anybody can do that. But to play with a drone is really good. The best thing is to play with a human drone, to get together with friends and play together, to play duets, and horn players will play quartets and duets with each other frequently, get sort of problems sort of fix themselves sometimes, which is a big thing that I like to think about with horn playing. So intonation, a very big part of accuracy is intonation. Another big part of accuracy is rhythm. So we're just falling back to the fundamental blocks, the building blocks of good musicianship, pitch and rhythm. But very often, if your rhythm is a little out of sync, if you're maybe not subdividing, and of course these kind of things you don't want to clutter your mind too much in a performance with subdividing before every entrance and these sort of things. But playing with good rhythm usually helps somebody's accuracy. Playing with great intonation usually helps with accuracy. There are getting into the nitty-gritty, and it's a very individualized things. Sometimes having the right mouthpiece and having the right horn. Some horns are, more or less have a smaller or larger bullseye. I mean, it's a case. Then at some point, it's a case by case thing also to help somebody's accuracy.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And generally speaking, if you have a clear thought of what you want the pitch to be, and the horn is set up to support that pitch happening, because you can't argue with the tube,
right?
And you know exactly when you want to produce it, you are very likely So I think
Yeah.
that probably having a good sense of relative intonation and this idea of sight singing, being able to hear
Hmm.
intervals builds
Yeah.
accuracy. And then for me, I noticed that when I'm low on trust or low on confidence, that I
Hmm.
tend to miss more. So if I'm questioning an
Hmm.
entrance,
Yeah.
it doubles the probability that I'll miss that entrance,
Yeah. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is the ultimate paradox. If I'm questioning it and I know
Yeah.
that's going to make me more likely to miss a note,
Right.
how do I undo that questioning? Have you ever, you know, worked with that paradox yourself or found any solutions?
Sure. Well, I very much try to immerse myself in the music and and just really in other words, this sounds oversimplified also, but in performance, especially in performance, to just kind of immerse yourself in the piece and immerse yourself into, the sound of what you're hearing, the colleagues around you, and sort of just being part of this whole incredible, experience of 100 musicians on stage playing one piece is sort of a unique thing. But if you can, like, sort of immerse yourself in that, and also give yourself a little bit of little forgiveness and little freedom, because the missed notes, they will happen, and if we sort of fight them, they may or may not happen more. We all know horn players that maybe don't miss notes, but then maybe the playing doesn't really touch you. It doesn't really speak to you. So
Yeah.
is that the solution? Well, no, maybe that's not the answer.
Hmm.
Maybe that's not the answer either.
Yeah.
So
You don't want to be that Yamaha trumpet playing robot.
yeah. So
Yeah.
there's also it's a case by case thing, but then there has to be a healthy balance. I mean, if you're playing a very exposed, Mozart violin concerto or a piano concerto or something, when it's just you and a few strings on stage and a couple horn players playing, and there's some high notes that you're playing with the music director, and you just really prefer not to miss.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
there are times that it's a little hard it's a little, admittedly so, because that's my job. Sometimes it's a little hard to not want that. So years of experience immersing yourself in the music, and and realizing that occasionally, here and then, there will be a missed note. It's not the end of the world,
Yeah.
and it's never the end of the world. And like I was saying before, it's never as bad as you think it is. When you go back and listen to it, it's never as bad.
Totally. I can second that. I often will record, I'll stick my iPhone in my pocket for a rehearsal or something and listen back when I'm driving home because
Hmm.
I don't have the archival
Yeah.
team with me everywhere that I
Yeah,
go
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah,
do
yeah,
that for
yeah.
me. And sometimes, like you, I'll just, oh man, that was abysmal playing.
Mm-hmm.
And then listen back. And what I realized is that when when I anyway chip a note, especially playing principal horn, which I'm doing a lot of these days, it's like time slows down.
Hmm.
Like Matrix mode is like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's this
Yeah, I
horrible
know.
moment that
Yeah.
you think lasted much longer than it really did. And
Right.
when I listen back very often, I think that was the most graceful missed note. It was just a
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right.
But the lasting, it's the shame and the reaction that is actually
Right.
way worse than the missed note.
Right. And it's a funny thing, because even with our colleagues, I'll walk off stage and say something to Jen, or Jen will say something to me, and I'm a horn player. We're both horn players, and
Mhm.
sometimes we don't even hear it.
Totally. So
Yeah.
I'm curious if you're willing to share a bit of a pivot, but I really want to dive into this because you are what I consider to be a consummate problem solver.
Hmm.
Having worked with you as a mentor and then also as a colleague, I see that your mind, you apply yourself to things and you have a great discography that I'm really impressed with your kind of world music stuff. What are the challenges for you now, and how do you approach those challenges as a
Well,
musician and horn player?
the challenges are very simple. Challenges are endurance, high range, and recovery from heavy playing from day by day. And they have been through my whole career challenges. Every player has their natural abilities and the things that they're good at and the things they have to sort of work at and keep on top of all the time. As you get older, the things the things you have to keep in check don't get easier. So for me, the things that I've had to focus on are endurance, high range, and recovery. This is completely mechanical, for lack of a better word, chop sort of stuff.
And what do you find helpful for yourself around that?
What I find helpful is what I find the most helpful is pacing. I've always done this since I've joined the orchestra. I've been playing in Philly for about 20 years. I got in the orchestra when I was in my early 40s. So I had already had, maybe for getting in an orchestra like that was maybe late in the game. But I'm very, very careful about looking at my schedule, and I'm very careful about pacing, looking what I have to do the next hour, what I have to do the next rehearsal, the next day, the next week, the next 3 weeks. So I look at my schedule literally 8 weeks ahead, and I look for trouble spots. I look for days that maybe will be, you know, a lot of repertoire, maybe some unavoidable chamber music, maybe some teaching and some things. I look for I look for trouble spots, and I have learned over the years to identify trouble spots, and I make sure that I don't show up to my trouble spot trashed with trash chops. Yeah, I have a lot of gas in the tank, so I pace myself. I'm very aware. This comes as a self-aware thing. I pace myself through rehearsals. Very often, you've played next to me in the Philly Orchestra. You know, lots of times I do not play loud, and there's a lot of things I do not play. I'll have my assistant play quite a things, and it's all really on purpose that I'm sort of pacing myself so I have enough for the concert, but not only for the concert, for the next morning's rehearsal. If we have back to back heavy concerts, heavy rehearsal the next morning, that back to back thing is always challenging for me. So my recovery, I've never been the kind of player that can play all day, put it in the case, take it out the case the next day, play all day, put it in the case, play all day. There are players like that. Oh my gosh, that's really fantastic. I wish I was. I've never been that kind of player. So being very organized by pacing myself, I tell my students always to play smart and to pay attention to your playing and to your body, to your chops, and to play smart. So that's one thing that has helped me a lot. I do warm up. I do not have a routine, but I warm up according to my needs, according to how
Yes.
I feel and to my needs of the day. Routines never really worked with me. I mean, I can't put myself in that same routine box. That works for some people, does not work for me.
I know that you just said you don't have a routine, but what are some of the
Mm,
ingredients or kind of puzzle pieces that go into your warm up?
yeah, I'd say I don't have a routine, but I suppose I do have a routine. It's just different every day. The key things are I warm up extremely lightly. I think what a lot of people call warm up to me is not a warm up. A lot of the routines and warm ups that I see, I know warm ups are really big guided warm ups. I mean, it's a very popular thing now. The teacher, warm up this, warm up that. And most all of them that I see to me are not really warm ups. They're more
Right.
like working out than
Yep.
warm ups. So
Yep.
my warm up is very light. It is not much pressure. It is very soft. It's with a small aperture, and it is in the mid range. It's nothing loud. It's nothing high. I just, for me, I need to get the aperture behaving. I need to get it behaving. I do a lot of breath attacks, and it tells me two things. The breath attack, first of all, will tell me if I'm stiff, if I if I have a little
Yeah.
damage to, if I have a little damage. What is recovery? Well, quite frankly, it's healing. It's recovery, but it's healing. You do things to your lip every day that cause tissue damage, and you actually have to heal. So recovery is healing. And if you're stiff that means that you have, if you're swollen and stiff, that's just a simple, that's a simple biological fact. Like anyone that works out,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
doing tissue damage that needs to be repaired, and it needs to be healed.
And there's ways to support that. Like I use, for example, Chop Saver is something I absolutely love. Jim Thatcher recommended hot chamomile tea bags alternating with ice cubes. And it really gets the blood flowing and supports the relaxation of the tissue.
Sure.
Inversions have been something, yoga inversions, getting the blood flowing, like more of active recovery has been really good for me.
Right.
What else is in your toolbox?
Hydration. I mean, one of the major things that gets me, especially on tour with traveling different time zones, being on a plane, having different diet, having different sleep cycle, is not drinking enough and being dehydrated. It's different for everybody, but the number one way that I can screw up my chops is by being dehydrated. So you're getting a good, you're getting a good long drink there.
I had a massive workout before this, and I think I just drank half a liter of water. Thank you. I didn't realize I needed that.
My things are simple. I mean, it comes down to the pacing things. I love to leave. I think Alan Sibble one time, I heard him say, or I think it was Alan Sibble, leave 20% that you can play more. Put it in the case. When you've got 20% left. It's such great advice. Horn players very often play till trash, and students particularly.
Easy to get injured when you're in that zone. That's a danger zone right there.
Yeah, put your horn in the case when you're still playing well.
Yeah.
That's great advice. Pacing yourself, being very hydrated. Sometimes I will, if I'm really stiff, I will take ibuprofen. It does help. I try not to get into the habit of it, but I'm very mindful of these kind of. Chop Saver is great. Robinson's remedy is great. Those kind of things are great. Anything with some people like arnica, and I think Gail Williams uses certain things, salves and whatever it is with arnica. I've talked about it with
Yeah,
Gail.
and Chop Saver has a good amount of arnica in it. I found that
Yeah,
it's like it has everything I need.
yeah,
What you just
yeah.
mentioned something that I really wanted to speak to, if we can
Mm.
rewind for a moment.
Sure,
Uh,
sure. Anything. Nothing out of bounds.
Oh, the ibuprofen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I've found that to be extremely effective. And I
Mm.
like you, I think it's a terrible habit to get into,
Mm.
but I believe that it's a very good prophylactic, because what happens if we're starting to get swollen is that you'll
Mm-hmm.
use worse technique.
Yeah.
And so you can injure yourself worse if you don't use ibuprofen and you've got
Mm-hmm.
that third gig of the day or whatever. I
Yeah.
find that it's actually safer to use the ibuprofen. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it
Yeah.
breaks the cycle. You can get into an
Mhm.
endless cycle,
Mhm.
and that's when you start to get in that cycle. Is when there are certain things that can, like ibuprofen, can really help when you're really playing a lot, and also just going back to playing smart, being very careful with loud playing. In my job, I have to play loud sometimes, but I'm very careful. I pick and choose very carefully
Mm.
when I play loud. And I'm always thinking of the next day. That's my greatest advice for any horn player is, sure, you can feel like Superman, Superwoman today, but just remember you might not feel like that tomorrow.
Think about
So
tomorrow is
yeah,
what you put on the billboard.
exactly. So, and a good warm up. I want to get back a little bit to the warm up thing.
Mm.
Not much pressure, breath attack, mid range. I like to gradually expand from the middle of the horn, gradually out, a little lower, a little higher, a little lower, a little higher. I do not play loud. I do not play high. And I do not use much pressure. I don't force out any note. If it doesn't come out, I don't care. My problem with some of the routines for myself, not for anyone else, but for myself, if a routine requires you to, play the whole dynamic and the whole range of the horn, some days I just can't do that in the morning. So I could do it if I used more pressure and played louder and maybe force the note out, but I don't want to do it. I want the note to come out the right way. I want things to
Yes.
come out as effortlessly as I can. So from day by day, that is a moving target. And if someday the high A or the high C doesn't come out, I don't care. Another day it will. But this is a warm up. For me, it's a warm up. And then I put the horn in the case, and then I'll commute into work, check my email, have a drink or so at the hall, and take a break. Then come back to the horn for more real playing.
Yep.
So I really want players to know the difference between working out and warming up. So that's a really important thing, and I think the term warm up is sometimes misinterpreted, misused. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's often blended with kind of a daily routine for building or for developing or maintaining something that is
yeah,
different from warming up for
that's
sure.
that's fine. That's
For
practicing. That's
sure.
fine.
For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
It's interesting. My warm up has changed a lot. It used to be much more routine, and I would start kind of in the mid register. But a few years ago, I had this whole kung fu awakening. It was right before I met you. I was training kung
Mm-hmm.
fu in Hong Kong, and I just learned about what it meant to be relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been doing Alexander technique and Feldenkrais and yoga for years, but somehow kung fu taught me what truly effortless force production felt like.
Mm-hmm.
And I could tell that in my horn playing that I was not being effortless,
Yeah,
that I was
yeah,
not mechanically set up. And
yeah.
so I went through this whole thing when I was at Bard that year where I thought I can play on this embouchure. I sounding good, winning auditions and
Mm-hmm.
playing well, but I don't think I want to for the next 20 years. And
Mm-hmm.
I know with the Kung Fu principles exactly where it should go and what it would feel like, but I sounded like a
Mm-hmm.
total beginner.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I changed my entire embouchure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I took a couple years off and invented the Modacity app and used that
Mm.
app to change my embouchure. And
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah,
was
yeah.
like
Yeah,
it was a
that's
whole
awesome.
thing. But on the
Yeah.
other side now, my range, I feel like I finally have come to like this peaceful interface with the instrument
Okay.
where if my first note wants to be a high C, like that's fine.
Yeah, that's good. If you
You
can do
know,
that without damage, that's great.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's really interesting. And
Yeah.
oftentimes for me, it's more of an emotional centering process that
Mm-hmm.
becomes a physical centering process. Like
Right.
I try to meet myself. Where am I? Am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling stressed? Am I feeling
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
joyful? And I just
Right.
start playing however I feel. So, this seems like a great place to interject with a shameless, in fact, delighted plug for the High Range Magic Bootcamp that I offer. So, high C is no longer the limit. I'm playing double Cs regularly, and I'm so excited to share this path with folks that want to liberate their high registers. So, if you are a player that is sick of tension, of uncertainty, insecurity, you feel defeated by the high range, or you just want to enter a new paradigm of confidence, relaxation, ease, musicianship, get in touch. I've got a link below where you can find out more information about high range magic, and I would love to share more with you. Now, back to the podcast.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It goes to the point of, I mean, people were audition centric,
Mm,
to a fault sometimes, because young players in conservatories, it's all about, winning the audition. And it's funny because what it takes to quote unquote win an audition is much simpler than people realize. And usually the person that wins an audition is just a player that sounds like they're not, it sounds like they're the least of the players working hard. And it's sort of something after also years and years of being on audition committees of all different instruments behind the screen. The things that, when you're preparing an audition, the things that concern the player, that get overly consume the player's time with preparing an audition, are very often not the things that are actually important to the committee, and
Could you
not the
say more
things.
on that, for example,
Yeah.
or a more tangible
Well,
illustration?
why am I talking about this? Because you were talking about, finding a way to play relax. Like, I don't want to play that way anymore. And that made me think about this point of, what is it in a player that wins an audition? And it's this simple fact of the player that sounds like they're not working hard. And what is the key to that? So what are some of the specific things? Sure, absolutely. Like when I'm coaching somebody taking an audition, they'll say, "Oh, what's your tempo in this excerpt? Where do you breathe in this excerpt? What's the style? Should I play my, brass horn, or should I play my 8D? What are they listening for? What do you think about this dynamic? Is this too soft? Is this too loud? Should I make more crescendo here or there? Should I do all of this, all of these things that I hear all the time in lessons?" And one of the most common is, where do you breathe and the tempo. These things are never discussed by the committee. They're never discussed. What is apparent to an audition committee behind the screen, if you hear someone playing in their comfort zone and that sounds like they're very comfortable, quite frankly, it doesn't really matter. All of these, things about phrasing and about musicality and choice of breath and choice of all these kind of things that we're talking about, short notes, long notes. Is that staccato too short? Is that staccato too long? All these sort of things sort of don't matter. So what does matter? Okay, intonation matters. Intonation matters. You have to play in tune. That's a non-starter. You have to play in tune with a good sound. Doesn't have to be a great sound. It has to be a good sound in tune, but nothing forced, nothing muscled, nothing that sounds like you are working too hard.
What do you think goes into making a good sound?
Well, that's a very good question, because it's not as simple, and this is something that's very, very hard to teach. It's virtually impossible to teach. You have to know what a good sound is. You have to know. And if you don't have the concept, that's very hard to teach. You can improve. And any students that I have that I want to work on their sound, it's just to start immersing yourself with listening to a lot of great players, and 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 going to concerts and hearing live music and live musicians play on any instrument, and start to really educate yourself on what is a really great sound. So if you do all of that and you're still not producing a good sound, that's the toughest thing, actually, because you have to be, this circles back to being self-aware. You have to be brutally self-aware sometimes, in a kind way to yourself, about how you sound. So that is, pick a player. If you can't figure out what a good sound is, pick a player that you love, and try to sound like that player. If you can't figure it out yourself, you can improve someone's sound. I always like to have every player play with their own voice. Your speaking voice is hard to get away from. It's impossible to get away from. I can talk like this, I can talk like this, but it sounds artificial. So your voice on the horn is going to be your voice. You can refine it, but it's sometimes very difficult to change. So you have to find your voice on the horn, refine it as beautifully as you can. That is more and less easy from player to player. Some players get it, some don't. So that's something that goes into the category of being self-aware.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to double click on something. You said that you feel like the horn world, certainly the world that you touch in on with a lot of college students and professional musicians, is a little overly audition focused. And I'm curious if you could wave a magic wand, thinking about the entire horn world. So not just pros and the amateurs and the students and the young ones and
Hmm.
the fans. If you could wave a magic wand and make some changes to the horn world,
Hmm.
what would you do? What would you ask the genie to change?
What would the genie change? I that's a great question. What would I ask to change? What do I see in the horn world? I think sometimes horn players need to be a little more aware of great virtuosic playing on other instruments to really hear the level, hear what's out there, and hear the level of of Hilary Hahn, hear the level of Janine Jansen, listen to Yo-Yo Ma, listen to oh my gosh, take your pick. I mean, these
Singers
are
too.
it's singers, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, just listen to we did some great things with Pretty Yende, and we work a lot with Angel Blue, and listen to great music making, and try to get away from sort of the limitations of horn playing. I think sometimes we're still a little bit of the meathead mentality. When I say meathead mentality, I think everybody understands what I'm talking about. But it's and sometimes, myself included, those moments in the orchestra are some of the most thrilling moments in horn playing, when you just kind of let it rip, and that's really fun. But letting it rip is as small in the whole art, being art, the whole artistic landscape. That's a small little sliver of the of what
Yeah.
of what we're trying to do. It's thrilling and it's fun, but sometimes that gets a little too much attention.
I couldn't agree
So
more. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
listen to great artists. Try to put into your own playing a high level of artistry, not just maybe what you hear on social media. I mean, I tell my students very often that there's a lot being posted on social media. There's a lot of players posting things, influencers on social media. There's a lot of horn playing that you can, anytime you click on Facebook, Instagram, anything, you can hear somebody playing something. But I think that the danger in that is that not everything out there is very high quality. And if you're a younger student, really educate yourself with great horn players, with great horn playing, and not just things that might be clickbait, because that seems to be really an avalanche of that sometimes.
Mm.
And hearing, there's no substitute for hearing live music, to hear great artists up close playing, Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. Go hear it. Just don't click on someone's 30-second Instagram post. So there's a bit of a disconnect. I mean, there's a place for that too, and there's a place for the letting it rip. But there's a lot of space for there's a lot of space for everything. I would like people to check out.
That's something I've always appreciated about you is you've been a tremendous advocate for artistry. I've told you this before that it really touched my life when you told me, I hear the music that you're making, I see what you're painting, but it's postage stamp sized, and I want to see a mural.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
That I think about that all the time.
Right.
With respect to the horn world, you made me wonder, especially naming people like Yo-Yo Ma and other artists that are doing more crossover stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scarcity mentality that really bugs me in the horn world. There's
Mm-hmm.
only so many orchestras positions, and there's more horn players than there are positions, and thus we have to compete.
Right. Right. Right.
And then it's auditions and competition and nose to the grindstone. When, in my opinion, a good half of the horn players out there are potentially amazing musicians and amazing players who aren't cut out for the orchestra world, but could be doing rock music or chamber music or funk or bluegrass or God knows EDM, whatever. What do you think about the potential what kind of shifts would have to happen to open up those avenues to make it more easy for horn players to thrive in their most authentic avenue of or genre of expression?
I think we're already seeing that happen. I mean, going back to the audition thing, having a full-time orchestra job in a top orchestra is one piece of the pie. I spent a big part of my career freelancing in New York City, doing recording work and playing on Broadway shows and playing freelance orchestras and doing all that stuff. So I have an incredible appreciation, all styles of music. I've played on record dates and from diaper commercials to rap albums and then early music. So I have incredible appreciation and experience for doing this, for doing sort of a very wide spectrum. But I think what you're talking about, I think thankfully we're seeing a lot more of that, but it takes a little more initiative from the individual player to sort of make his own way. We hear a lot about entrepreneurship. We hear a lot about, sort of in finding alternative careers, alternative ways to the orchestral path. But to your point, orchestral path is one. Someone will say, well, I want to go into teaching. That's another path, or chamber music. But in between all of those, there are many others. And I'm seeing horn players now, forming their own groups, and the groups that maybe not fall into well, sure, chamber music, maybe it's a small group, but maybe it's not really chamber music. Maybe it's crossover, maybe it's a little jazz, maybe it's a lot of different things. But to do this, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of dedication, there's a lot of persistence, but I will say there's a lot of money out there that can be tapped into. And there's an audience and there is funding. This is a skill that we're sort of now getting on board in the universities and sort of teaching entrepreneurship, where to look for the funding, how to write the grants, how to get the proposals, how to get the commissions, how to start a new group, how to get yourself out on social media. There's all of these things that can be done and are being done. It's not for everybody. Some people thrive. Some players are doing very well with these kind of groups and are really thriving. It's not easy work, especially the funding, because in the end of the day, if you're if you're playing the most interesting sort of like inventive, cutting edge music ensemble and getting commissions and doing all sorts of interesting things, that's great. We all need to put food on the table. So a big part of that is going out and getting the funding. But the good news is the money is out there. There's a lot of willing patrons, a lot of people are willing to fund these projects. It just has to be presented in a very convincing and a very artistic and a very authentic way for people to buy in and be inspired to get behind a group. I mean, the first thing that has to happen is the inspiration. I mean, the inspiration, you have to, and if you're looking for backers, if you're looking for sponsors, they need to be inspired.
Yeah.
And we all know quality. We know when we hear a good performance. We know when we hear a good music group. We know when we hear an average wedding band. We know what's good. We know what's interesting. So there's this balance of that and respect and kudos to the players who are willing to take the risk to do that. In the meantime, before groups become really successful, outside work. So there's a lot of things to do. Teaching. I mean, my gosh. I mean, we all teach. Teaching can really put food on the table.
It's also a great service to the next generation.
Great service. While you're trying to pursue create something, I think of the Imani Winds, who have become, now the Imani Winds are, the Imani Winds. They didn't start out like that. They did not start out like that. I remember in the early days, they were just one of how many wind quintets how many brass quintets have we played? How many wind quintets have we played in? They were just a group of friends that got together and started playing wind quintets. How often does that happen? All the time. But they became the Amani Winds because they had sort of relentless in their pursuit of what they wanted to do. And it was all artistry, and it was authentic. It was driven by great artistry. It was authentic, great artistry. And so any group, I use that as a model. There are many other, there are many other groups that have, but that's just one comes to mind because some of the players are friends of mine. But it took a lot of work and a lot of slim years. It was, so it's this sort of level of dedication that is. There are other groups that come to mind that are doing incredibly well now. So yeah, it's out there.
And that harkens back to what you said about the most successful students, that they've got that passion, that fire, that curiosity, the artistry, and they just keep showing up week after week after week.
Yeah.
And also back to this idea that you were talking about from the COVID learnings, that providing music is truly valuable. And when people value what you produce, they're willing to pay for it. And a concept that I love sharing with my musician friends is this 1,000 true fans. If you have 1,000 true fans and they're paying $20 a month, you're making $20,000 a month. And it's not hard really in this day and age with the kind of dedication that we're talking about to build that 1,000 fan base in a year or two, even if you're really doing the thing.
Yeah. If it's authentic, if it's really from the heart and really authentic and for the right reasons, absolutely. Wow.
Beautiful. Well, I've really enjoyed this. I've got a few rocket round questions, and then we can wrap up. All right. What's a pearl of wisdom that a teacher of yours shared with you?
Oh, pearl of wisdom. Let's see. My teacher at Juilliard used to say, this is a very horn-centered, horn-geeky thing, but he would say that the low range, like he would say the tallest buildings have the biggest foundations. The taller the building, the bigger the foundation. And he was obsessed with the low range. Whether you're a high horn player or a low horn player. My teacher, yeah.
Who was this?
Ray Diantinis. And he always used to say, the taller buildings have the biggest foundations. And that's sort of true with horn playing. I sort of still believe that. And I kind of put that into my own playing. It works for me. I think I'm a low player at heart. I probably should not be a high horn player. I probably should be a low horn player. But I think that's good advice for any horn player. It's a pearl. That's the first one that comes to mind. So in other words, develop your low range when you're playing. He used to say, when you're playing in the low range and it sounds really great, you're playing correctly. And I kind of, maybe not 100%. There are certain situations where that may not be entirely true, but he believed that 100%, and I believe it 99%. 99.
Great answer.
99%. Yeah.
Next question. Was there a formative piece of music, a recording of a hornist or an orchestra that really touched you and kind of inspired you, gave that spark of sound when you were growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. I listened to the Chambers album, James Chambers, a lot. I listened to Dale Clevenger and the Chicago Symphony and Dennis Breen. And I always thought that I didn't want to sound like either of them, but I wanted to sound like a combination of them. And I wanted to have the power and the sort of the power and the total command of the instrument as Clevenger, the richness of Chambers, the absolute richness that you can, that you can grasp, and it's just, you can touch it. That sound is so rich, and the finesse and the artistry of Dennis Brain. So, that was, those three were, I always imagined putting those three players together. And yeah, so it wasn't one, it was three.
There it is. That's the holy trinity of Jeff Lang's horn approach.
That was for me. I also listened a lot, of course, in my generation. We listened to Barry Tuckwell a lot, and just the sheer fact that he was playing everything on the horn imaginable was also really, really eye-opening. But it was, Chambers, Clevenger, Dennis Brain.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that you've achieved that.
Well, I've tried. I try. If I only had a better lip, but once in a while it comes out.
I hear it. Just you naming that, I was like, oh yeah, I can totally hear that. So, okay, favorite etude or, exercise?
Koprush.
Oh,
Koprush. Yeah.
why is that?
Koprush is my go-to because if you approach it, if you play Koprush correctly, and you approach it and really refine everything, you can sort of, to me, everything is sort of in there. I mean, there's some of the slow Koprashes are really great. Obviously, the technical ones, I mean, they all have a specific purpose. And if you can play at a very refined level, I love Koprash. That would be the number one. I love the Conconi lyrical etudes too. I think we used to do those together.
Cool. All right, last question. If you had a billboard that you can put in front of all horn players that as they're opening up their case, they get to go past the billboard, what would it say?
It would say sound.
Period, or an exclamation point, or a question mark?
Yeah. It could be all. Probably exclamation point. I want sound on the horn. We are a sonic instrument. Most little kids, when you ask anyone, this again, also like 40 years of experience of being in the classroom, asking, 13-year-old horn players, why did you pick the horn? Most every time they will say, I like the sound.
Yeah.
You don't hear that from other instruments. Most people pick the French horn because they will say, I like the sound. We're a sonic instrument. We're all about the sound. And sometimes I would like to see us, return to really, sound is the focus of really what we're going for, a really beautiful, unique sound. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it is.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Is there any way that horn players can reach you, find out any projects that you're doing? I know you have a discography, you've got your teaching, you've got your performances.
Well, anybody can shoot me an email anytime. Come to hear the Philadelphia Orchestra. I'm easy to find, and anybody has any questions anytime, anything music related, nothing out of bounds. Always feel free to ask me anything. Sure.
You have a website or a social media?
There's a website. That is updated. That kind of shows pretty much what I'm up to. I don't have the current concerts and that sort of thing, but of course the Philly website and any kind of significant chamber music and things like that I do. But it's all usually things get posted on Facebook, and I've got some things on YouTube. If anyone wants to YouTube search, I got some nice performances on YouTube. There's a good Brahms trio up there on YouTube that I did in Boston.
Cool. I'll drop your website and the link to that Brahms trio in the notes below.
Thanks. Cool.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. It was so fun.
Awesome. All right. See you, Mars.